Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good morning. I'm Mark Cansey, and a senior advisor at CSIS, and I'd like to welcome you all to our event this morning. It's a great opportunity to have Generals McConville and LaCamera join us for a discussion of the Army in the Indo-Pacific region. The generals need little introduction to this group. General McConville is the 40th Chief of Staff of the Army, a senior Army aviator. He's qualified to pilot a variety of Army aircraft. He's commanded at every level from the company to the division. And he has considerable experience in Washington, having served on the Joint Staff and as the Army G1 for personnel and as the Vice Chief of Staff before stepping up as the Chief when General Milley became Chairman. General LaCamera is Commander of the U.S. Army in the Pacific. He's commanded at every level from the company to the Corps. A Ranger, he's also led forces in the Special Operations community. Both generals are veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would note that this is both an exciting and a challenging time for the Army. On the one hand, the Army has been nurturing a wide variety of new technologies, several of which are on the cusp of moving from the lab to the field. The Army is also experimenting with new kinds of force structures to adapt to the demands of great power competition. On the other hand, this is happening as DoD budgets have likely peaked and there will be severe competition for resources. Many strategists and budgeteers are looking at the Army, particularly its end strength, as an offset to fund air and maritime priorities. They question the Army's role in the Indo-Pacific region. The format of our event today will be that the generals will give some brief remarks, then I'll have a short conversation with them, and finally we will open the floor to questions that have come in from the audience. So with that, I will turn the floor over to General McConville.
Well, thank you, Mark, and it's great to be here with you today. And I just want to highlight, yesterday was National Vietnam Day, and I think for all those out listening, a special thanks to our Vietnam veterans for what they've done. We stand proudly on their shoulders. They left us a great legacy. So if you know a Vietnam vet, please thank them for all of us. And as you said, very challenging times this last year, exacerbated by COVID, civil unrest, national disasters, all the time while we've been conducting global operations around the world. So I'm very, very proud of what our people have been doing, our soldiers, and our people are really been the pathway to the readiness and modernization. As you said, every 40 years, the Army goes under a major transformation, I would argue. It happened in 1940. It happened in 1980 when some of us came in the Army, and we're in 2020, and we're in the process right now of taking a look at the future, the type of capabilities that we need to provide for the Joint Force. And it's not just new equipment, although that's important. It's new doctrine, it's new organizations, it's new ways we're going to train. It's a 21st century talent management system. And we are aligned with the Joint Force. We're aligned with our allies and partners in the region. And we know in the future, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or it's other places around the world, we'll go as a joint team, and all the service chiefs are working very closely to provide that capability, along with working very closely with our allies and partners to get after that. So we look forward to the discussion, and back to you, Mark.
Mark, you're muted.
Thank you very much, General. Let me turn the floor over to General LaCamera for a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Chief, for the opportunity to participate today. And I'll echo those thanks to our Vietnam veterans out there. And good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to participate and talk over the great things that our soldiers and civilians are doing out here in the Indo-Pacific. And as the Chief said, we're not going to go alone. It's going to be a joint. It's going to be a combined. It's going to be an interagency fight. And on a day-to-day basis, we're out here in the competition phase. In the Indo-Pacific, it's critical to retain our vital economics, global economics. It's home to 4 billion people. 36 countries of 24 of the world's 36 megacities. That's 10 million plus people. For the 5 priority security challenges in the national security strategy are out here. It also includes natural and man-made disasters, negative impacts to climate change, rapid population growth, disease, and as we're all living pandemics. We are the Army's largest Army Service Component Command with about 52,000 personnel assigned, another 25,000 available, so a total of 77,000 on a given day. But that does not include the organizations that we get for our exercises. And this year for the Army, Defender Pacific 21 is a large exercise for the United States Army, and we'll bring forces from Forces Command to come and participate out here west of the international date line and also on the west coast of the United States. So the area of the U.S. Army Pacific starts on the west coast of the United States all the way to the west coast of India and from the North Pole to the South Pole. Our daily focus is on competition. We've got to be ready to respond in crisis, and we've got to be prepared to win in conflict. And what doesn't change is the last 100 meters is still the most dangerous piece of ground on the face of the earth in conflict. And so the focus of making sure that our forces are trained and ready to fight in that last 100 meters is absolutely critical and something that I focus on and think about every single day. We also do provide for the Army some environmental training. We have the Northern Warfare Training Center in Alaska, which focuses on Arctic and mountaineering. We also have the Jungle School here on Oahu. Good news at the Jungle School here is we don't have any animals that will kill you. Bad news is when you go west of the international date line, you will run into things that can kill you. And recently, last summer, we had some Thai soldiers here training. They were disappointed that there were no snakes on the island. I told them, please don't bring them here. The locals will not be happy with that. But we had a great training event with them, and it was in preparation for their Joint Readiness Training Center exercise. And so with that, we talk about COVID, but we've been able to continue to train in bubbles. We've been able to create bubbles. When the COVID lockdown, for lack of a better term, started a year ago, we were deployed west of the international date line, and we were able to stay in Thailand for a period of time to continue to train in that environment and bring our soldiers back with zero COVID positive, demonstrating that we could do that. And we've built on that over the past year, allowing us to train. But the challenge is as we, the Standing Theater Joint Land Force Component Command, responsible for Indo-PACOM's response to COVID in FEMA Region 9, our partners and allies have the same responsibilities in their countries. And so we've had to temper our op tempo has been tempered by the fact that they've got to focus on their citizens, much like we focus on our citizens. But we have been able to adapt to that, and we have been able to continue to train. And then lots of opportunities, as stated. We have Defender Pacific 21 coming up, and the plan is to continue to create the bubbles, the training bubbles to operate. We'll work with the countries within the limitations of what they can handle, given the requirements that they do have. And with that, I'll pass back to you, Mark, and look forward to the discussion and questions.
Well, thank you very much, General. Let me start with the top level question, which is, what is the Army's role in a great power conflict in the Indo-Pacific region? There's been a lot of discussion about that, and maybe some controversy. And let me turn to General LaCamera, since he's out there, and give him the first word on this.
Well, it's to be part of a joint combined fight, to work with our partners and allies is the top priority. And then we, provide over 51% of the, logistics to the other services. Obviously, we are the largest ground force. So if there's a fight on land, we'll be the ones participating in that. But as a joint, with our Marine brothers and sisters, as we move forward, with long range precision fires, taking and holding, us grabbing a piece of ground that then facilitates, operational maneuver with our operational fires that sets the conditions for the Air Force and the Navy. Is part of that. And then, with all the different warfighting functions, whether it's intelligence, fires, protection, we're integrated into the air missile defense and command and control as we go forward. So we have a role that we play. We exercise it as often as possible. The Commander Indo-PACOM, Admiral Davison, talks about the joint fight. So we've integrated our forces. We have the multi-domain task force that we're using out here. We used them last year in an Army exercise, and then we turned around and chopped them to Pac Fleet, and Admiral Aquilino used them in his exercise. So again, as we work through operations activities and investments, and we experiment out here in the next fight, getting back to large-scale combat operations, I think we play a critical role to the success of operations out here.
Well, thank you very much. General McConville, let me give you the floor.
No, I think we'll appreciate that. And, when I take a look at, what's the Army's role in conflict, I want to roll it back to what's the Army's role in competition, because we really don't want to get to great power conflict. And what we're providing in the Indo-Pacific is really what the combatant commander has asked in the joint force has supported, is that security force assistance brigades that can advise and assist our allies and partners and work very closely. And Paul and his team are doing a very good job of employing them. We talked about the multi-domain task force, and that operates below the level of armed conflict, and that brings long-range precision effects, intelligence capabilities, information operations capabilities, cyber, electronic warfare, and space. And it also has the capability to provide precision long-range fires as we develop those capabilities, and we're in the process of doing that, and the combatant commander has asked for that. We're certainly involved in the air and missile defense capability, the logistics support that they've asked for. We're using watercraft. We're not a Navy, but we do have a watercraft capability that is in demand, and also working very closely with our partners in how we protect the force. And that's where the Joint All-Domain Command and Control System comes into play. We've added a C to that because we recognize the importance of our allies and partners, but the services working together, tying sensors through some type of integrated battle command system with artificial intelligence allows us to get the sensor to the right shooter and then provide the lethal effects that I think ends up in deterrence. And so the role of the Army is certainly to be there for competition, to be there to help de-escalate crises. And if we have to go to conflict, then what we provide is the ability to gain and hold ground for the duration of a campaign, to mass fires, to mass logistics, and protect and work very, very closely with the rest of the force.
Well, thank you. Let me ask then the follow-on question, which is, what changes does the Army need to make in its structure and equipment to be more effective in great power competition? Let me go to General McConville first.
Yeah, let me start with that. We've done a lot of experimentation to get after what we call our transformational developments that we're going. And so we've come out with our modernization priorities: long-range precision fires, the ability to penetrate an anti-access air denial capability, the ability to provide an anti-ship capability from land. And as we've done our experimentation and simulation, we've found this to be a valuable contribution to the joint force. We recognize that we need to develop a next generation combat vehicle, so we're doing that. We've taken a look at our aircraft, and we believe that we need more speed and more range, so we're developing those. As far as the network, we recognize, like the other services, the importance of being able to do machine-to-machine data passing and information passing, so we can get to what we call convergence, which allows us to get to lethal effects in a matter of seconds, vice a matter of minutes. And we're doing a lot in the air and missile defense capability, recognizing unmanned aerial systems, swarms are going to be something we have to deal with. And again, what we want to be able to do is provide the right shooter with the right sensor for the threat that we see from the air. So we're working very, very close on that. And we're doing a lot in our, as far as our soldiers' lethality goes, with new weapon systems and improved night systems. But to us, it's not just about new technology. It's really focused on the soldier, and it's about a new way we're going to fight, which is our multi-domain operations doctrine. It's a new organization we talked about. We talked about the SFAB. We talked about the multi-domain task forces. We're talking about some information-capable organizations, how we train using augmented reality and virtual reality and synthetic training environment. And then most important is really our 21st century talent management system, getting the right person, the right job at the right time. And so that's all coming together of how the Army is going to contribute to the future fight. You know, there's that old adage about, generals are always trying to win the last fight or fight the last fight better. Quite frankly, we're trying to work with the joint force and our allies and partners to make sure that we, can deter the future contract. And winning to us is really not have to fight, but we have to have a credible capability deter those who wish us harm.
Thank you. General LaCamera, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would. What I would add on to the Chief's comments is, we're taking, the lessons learned from the last, 20 years of fighting in a different environment, boiling it down to the fundamentals, and then applying it to this environment. The Chief talked about Security Force Assistance Brigade, and having used them in Iraq and Syria last year, that was they were used one way. But in this environment with our partners and allies, it's less of an advisory role, and it's more of the interoperability role of working with our partners and allies who have the experience in different environments. So we're taking, what we're doing from the Army's perspective, and we're adapting it to the environment out here, which has, Arctic, which has, mountains. It's got the jungle, which is something that we're getting back into, from previous conflicts, et cetera, and that expertise and learning from our partners and allies, and understanding how they operate in that. We're taking the multi-domain task force, and we're working with our partners and allies. There's several countries here. They're not going to create the multi-domain task force, but they understand the multi-domain operations. The Japanese use the term cross-domain operations, but that's their version of them. So working with them, working with the Australians and others on how they're adapting to the current environment, and how we can, be interoperable with the different partners and allies, which I think will be different than some of the other ASCCs. I don't think it'll be a one size fit all, because the environment is different. And then making sure that we can work with with the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force out here, and in the interagency piece. So taking the Army concepts, adapting it to the environment here to make sure that we can be successful, and we're competing on a day-to-day basis. You think the kill web or the kill chain, it's really the kill web. This isn't about going after arrows. This is about going after the archer. And, how do we position ourselves to be able to do that and be successful?
Thank you. Let me ask a question about the concept of operations in the Western Pacific and how that relates to the Marine Corps, because General Berger has articulated a version where the Marines will develop long-range fires, anti-ship, anti-ground, that they will create bubbles inside an enemy's or an adversary's what they call weapons engagement zone, and that vision sounds somewhat similar to some of the things I've been hearing the Army articulate. And I was just wondering how the Army would distinguish what it proposes to do in the Western Pacific from what the Marine Corps is proposing to do. And let me start with General McConville.
Well, first of all, I think we have a great Marine Corps. We've fought side by side, all of us in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think, as I discussed with General Berger, what he's doing with the Marine Corps is an expeditionary force, maritime focused, that can operate very quickly and get to the places that they need to provide those type of effects. He is developing some long-range precision fires with those capabilities. But as we take a look at what we're developing for the Army, these are certainly can be used in the Pacific when we look at long-range precision fires. The systems we're developing are more along the lines of a campaign rather than in a quickly expeditionary type systems. And so when, I don't see us in competition with the Marine Corps. We got a great Marine Corps. They have roles and missions that are extremely important, as does the United States Army. And I think when I take a look at the size of the forces that we have, every single armed force member is absolutely key, along with our allies and partners, in providing the deterrence that we need to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. General LaCamera.
Yeah, I'd echo the Chief's comments. I think what we also provide is the mass piece of that. I meet regularly with the MAR-4 PAC commander. We exercise regularly with them, Cobra Gold, Bala-Catan, and some of the other things that we're experimenting with Defender and Forger this year. So I think we're, whether they're there first and we come in behind them, that allows them to continue to move on. It really is based on, how do we work well within the concept, the design that the commander of Indo-PACOM, how he's going to fight. And I think that's what the operations activities, investments, the experimentation that we do out here. We can use the past as being, it can be instructive, but it's not a blueprint. And as they bring on capabilities, as we bring on capabilities, we're experimenting together to make sure that we can not just compete, but in a crisis respond and win if we've got to fight.
Great, thank you. Let me ask about differences between a great power competition, a great power conflict, and regional conflicts. And out there in the Pacific, you see that difference between China and North Korea, two threats to U.S. security, but also very different threats. And some people have argued that all the services need to have different capabilities for those two kinds of adversaries. And I was wondering about the Army's perspective on what you might call the regional versus the great power adversary, and whether the requirements are different and how much they overlap. And let me start with General McConville.
Oh, what I think, as I look around the world, and we can certainly look at North Korea, we can certainly look at the Indo-Pacific, and quite frankly, we can look at the around the rest of the world. And what I've seen, at least in my experience over 40 years, is we never quite get the threat right. We think we may do something, or we think we're going to do something, and we end up going somewhere else. So when I take a look at least from the Army standpoint, is what we want to do is provide options for General LaCamera, option for the COCOM commander, Admiral Davison, and then allow them to take what we're providing and integrate that into a joint plan. But the thing we do know, at least as we've done our experimentation and simulation, speed matters, range matters, convergence matters, and probably one of the most important things, and to get us what we call decision dominance, so we can provide lethal effects very, very quickly. And as we look into the future, we see that giving us the overmatch that we're going to need, that hopefully will deter those who wish us harm. But if it doesn't, what we have seen to have that capability, we can defeat them and defeat them soundly if required to do so.
Thank you. General LaCamera.
Yeah, I guess I look at I brought that up earlier with, the last 100 meters being the most dangerous piece of ground. So as we prepare the formation to be able to fight and survive and win in that, I think it's the same. I mean, for potentially both. The terrain is obviously different, or could be different. You do have mega cities, so we've got to take that into account. Last fall, I co-chaired a conference bringing in our partners and allies with the Philippine Chief of Army, who's now their Chief of Defense, to talk about mega cities and how we would fight in there and how we would adapt to that piece. So I think there's some similarities. I think at the operational and strategic level, it changes a little bit. I think the levers that the Chinese have vice what the levers that the North Koreans have. When you think of the elements of national power, E being probably the most, where they have the ability to impact a lot more people. So I think all of that gets tossed into it at the operational and strategic level. That we'll have to work with the Indo-PACOM commander on it. But at the tactical and operational level, I think the fights they're not exactly the same, but we do have to continue to focus on the basics and take the equipment that the Army and the weapons that they're giving us and the other joint services that have and apply it to that environment.
Great, thank you. Let me ask one last question for General McConville, then I'll turn to the questions that are coming in from the audience. And this is about the size of the Army and whether there is a minimum size for the Army. General, you talked about how you would like to see at least a regular Army at the sort of 500,000 level if that were possible, but of course resources are very constrained. The Commission on the Army set a minimum size of 980,000 for the total Army, but back when we were looking at sequestration and coming off of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, people were looking at a regular Army of maybe 450,000 or 420,000. So I was wondering, is there a minimum size of the Army in peacetime, that would allow it to meet all of the obligations that it has both in wartime and in day-to-day operations?
Well, I think that the size of the Army should be determined by the strategy that the policy makers want to execute. And from experience, and I've talked about, I've had leaders that have sat in my seat recently that have said, we need, and we certainly can show the analysis an Army that's above 540,000. There's other people have taken a look and said that's about the right size for the Army. The Army right now sits about 485,000. I can, would like to grow it more. I don't think, as we don't have a budget yet, but again, I'm, taking a look at the decisions that will have to be made. 485,000, a little over $1 million for the total force is where the force sat on 9/11, and we had to grow the force to on active duty to 720,000 during the peak, 570,000 regular Army, 150,000 National Guard to execute operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you get an idea of what we think the size could be, or how quickly you'd have to grow the Army depending on the plan. So from where I sit, I think that about 485 right now is probably what we can afford. We'll have to see where the budget goes. And then again, for what chiefs do is they got to take a look at the strategy. They got to take a look at the priorities. I've already said that, we're not going to send anyone into combat that's not ready. So we do have to spend money on readiness, and the force right now is very ready. A few years back, we were not during sequestration. So we feel good about where we are as readiness. But I also believe strongly that we must transform the force now. We must modernize it. We must get the force ready for the next 40 years, because our competitors are. And if we're going to compete and deter then we need to maintain the overmatch that we must have as part of the joint force.
Okay, thank you. And I will turn to questions that are coming in from the audience, and there are two that have come in about the Korean Peninsula. So one of them is about the Army's plans to respond to the North Korean ongoing threat and the increasing threat that it poses for missiles and nuclear weapons. And then a related question came in regarding the exercises on the Korean Peninsula. You know, they had been curtailed under the Trump administration, and the question is whether those will be reinstituted and whether the Army needs to reinstitute them. So, General LaCamera.
Yeah, those. I mean, I think those two questions really go, but should go to General Abrams. I mean, my responsibility as the Army Service Component Command is to get him what he needs to be successful. So I think that's a conversation between him and the Indo-Pacom commander and the chairman on the assets that he needs, and it's our responsibility to make sure that as we bring forces from CONUS, that they are trained and ready to do that, and that the requirements that I have for responding are filled.
Okay, great. Let me ask a question that's come up in sort of several venues regarding lines of communication in the Pacific. For the maybe first time in 70 years, those lines of communication will potentially be threatened. We have a question here from George Barrett, who's an Army civilian, about how the Army will meet the requirements to deploy Army forces when the ability and capability to lift forces by sea and air is limited and threatened. So let me start with General McConville and then turn to General LaCamera.
Well, I think as we take a look at the future, I think all the services are assuming that we're going to be contested in all domains, which is very, very different than right now. So we're going to be contested certainly on the land, which we have in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in the sea, also in the air, also in cyber, and also in space. And so what that comes down to is how we position the force, and calibrated force posture becomes very, very important of where our forces are. And that's where this discussion goes. What do you pre-position forward? What equipment do you put forward? And how do you rotate forces through dynamic force employment so you have the right amount of forces in the right place at the right time? And that's the general philosophy for the United States Army. And Paul can talk, maybe a little more specific about the actual region.
Okay, General LaCamera. Yeah, I think some of the strategic and operational, we won't be able to take that for granted like we have in the past. I think our adversaries, will have the ability to prevent it, and I think then that becomes a very deliberate operation to create, to create the window to be able to reinforce with forces, whether it's over the land, the land, the sea, or the air. So I think it'll be a lot more deliberate. There'll be portions that, they can't control everything. So there'll be portions that will have, freedom of movement. But I think then the operational maneuver or strategic maneuver will have to set conditions to do that. There's the potential impact of commercial and other transportation that'll have to be taken into account, that will have to be protected as things move. So I think it'll be a very different piece. And then when you look at the tyranny of distance, the sail times and the flight times and whatnot, and you can't look at this area on a flat map. You really got to look at it looking at a globe. And some places look a little closer on a globe, but again, when you're dealing out here, you are dealing with some great distances that will have to be protected. So I think protection will, for that warfighting function, will play a huge role as we go forward to be able to move capabilities between bubbles, so create open a window, move the force, and then close it. I'm not sure we will be able to keep it open, 24/7 like we have in the past.
Great, thank you. Another question has come in from Tony Capaccio in Bloomberg News, building on comments that General McConville just made regarding our allies. And the question is, how much of a political military challenge will the Army and the Indo-Pacific have to convince allies to allow the U.S. To base Army units, for example, the multi-domain task forces and post-INF range weapons on their territory in the first island change, such as Japan? So let me start with General McConville, then we'll turn to.
Well, I think, this is, you said that's a political decision. The administration will, I believe, lead with a policy, and that will be shaped by diplomacy between our countries and our allies and partners based on their national security interests. And then we will support with security. And again, that'll be one of those type things that each country is going to have to take a look at that and see what type of capabilities they're willing to accept. And then on our side, what we're willing to employ in support of that partnership. So from where we sit, at least at the Army, is what we're doing is providing options, which become dilemmas to our competitors. And the politics or the policy of where they're actually based and how they're based will be worked out through the policymakers and the diplomats.
Thank you. General LaCamera.
Yeah, I agree with the chief. I mean, we have some treaty allies out here, and we'll work with them. But again, at the point of the conflict or incident, I think the diplomats and the policymakers will negotiate what it is, and we'll be prepared to respond and adapt accordingly.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from the Air Force. Actually, this is from Orville Wright, president of the Air Force Association. That's a great name for president of the Air Force Association. And the question is, does the Army's emphasis on deep strike and precision fires duplicate Air Force fighter and bomber capabilities? And does significant budget investment in new Army long-range deep strike fires actually create increased budget and employment risk for airmen who will be tasked to attack deep targets? And this question has come up, I think, a number of times from Air Force commentators. So I'll start with General McConville.
Yeah, I think, when we take a look at long-range precision fires, we don't see that in competition with the great job that the world's greatest Air Force does as far as striking targets deep. To me, this is about providing options to a combatant commander, options from the land that gives them the capability to, in some ways, even deter with strategic counterfire or suppress air defense or, strike, ground targets through a different method, and quite frankly, not necessarily putting pilots at risk. But my experience has been when you provide multiple options, which causes the adversary to deal with multiple dilemmas, you have a much better chance of protecting the force and achieving your objectives than having one organization go alone.
Okay, great. Is there anything you'd like to add there, General LaCamera?
I think this is about providing multiple dilemmas to our adversaries. There's an inherent risk in the business, and that's why we train with each other. That's why it's important to train in our joint training centers and to work together so that we can bring that risk down.
Great, thanks. We have a question on equipping that maybe builds on something we've talked a little about before about aligning Army capabilities with new threats. This comes from Steve Dalzell at Rand Corporation. And his question is, beyond generally needing the next generation of combat vehicles and aircraft, are there specific considerations to make these systems appropriate for the likely battlefields in the Pacific? He notes that the M1 was great for open plains and deserts, but does the Army need vehicles more suited for urban operations, jungles, islands, that sort of thing? So let me turn to General McConville here.
Well, you talked about vehicles in aircraft, and I became a believer of armored vehicles in Iraq, having spent a lot of time in air assault and lighter type units in training, but actually going into an urban environment like Sardis City, or going into Fallujah, or going into Najaf, you quickly learn the value of having some type of armor capability, which we certainly want to take a look at the weight of certain vehicles. But what we feel right now is the future in ground combat is the next generation combat vehicle, which can get our troops to the decisive point. And we believe we're going to have to do that even with the technology. There's always going to be a role, and almost always, that we're going to have to put soldiers or Marines on the ground, and we want to give them the best capability to do that. And then, as far as on the aircraft side of the house, especially as we look at the ranges that we see in the Pacific, we believe that the future vertical lift aircraft that we are looking at are going to provide us range and speed that's going to give us the capability, not only in that area, but any place else that we operate where there's long ranges that we need to accomplish the mission. So we take a look at the next generation combat vehicle replacing the Bradley, and the future vertical lift providing us unique capabilities that we need in the future.
Okay, let me give General LaCamera a moment here, although I realize this is mostly a Washington issue, but if there's anything that you would like to add.
I would just say that I think it's our responsibility to help inform those decisions and talk about the environment and experiment and provide that feedback back to the chief.
Great, thanks. We have a question on technology and networking, particularly in the Pacific because of its large size. This comes from Jackson Barnett, FedScoop. And the question is, what technology are you developing to maintain connectivity and convergence over the great distances in the Pacific theater? And are you working with Space Command for satellite connectivity? So let me start again with General McConville.
Now, we recognize the importance of connectivity, and as you mentioned, there's multiple ways of going. That space is certainly absolutely critical to everything we do. I think the Army, we're certainly one of the biggest users of space because most of our systems have something, whether it's global position satellite, it's long range radios, it's early warning for some of our systems. It comes from space. So we are a big user of space. And one of the things that Paul talked about, though, was the idea of webs. We recognize, as we build these systems, they have to be resilient. And we assume that they're going to be attacked and they're going to try to be defeated. So it's got to be a very resilient web. And we see multiple ways of doing that. We use a term called PACE, primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. As we build our systems, we are putting those in place.
Great, thank you. General LaCamera, again, this is tends to be a Washington issue, but let me give you a chance to weigh in.
No, we've got to look at the communications architecture that exists out here. Again, 4 billion people live out here. there is some infrastructure. What can we use to our advantage? And we look at the different spectrums that are out there, and how can we operate? Is it different? When you're transmitting over water, and to your point, we are working with the functional combatant commands on how we can go forward. Again, different environment. We've got to provide that feedback. But I think the infrastructure that's out here, we got to understand what can we use to our advantage over.
Great, thank you. We have a question about multi-domain task forces, and both of you have talked about those already. The question is about whether the Army will be establishing a second MDTF in the Pacific, and then what you're thinking about in terms of basing. Would it be more appropriate to get one in a host nation? And what are the challenges for standing up the MDTF? And I think maybe more generally, how do you see that concept playing out? And we'll start with General McConville.
Yeah, as we build the multi-domain task forces, one of the things that we're kind of informing is it is a task force, and each area we're taking a look at least building 2 for the Indo-Pacific. We're looking at building 1 for Europe. As far as positioning, again, that we're going to wait for the policymakers to decide where's the best place to put them, but they will be deployable and even by parts. So some parts of the organization, as General LaCamera has said, have already been deployed. They're working. We're in a campaign of learning, trying to get this right. From where we sit, what we want to provide the commander in the field is the capability for long-range precision effects, especially operating in the competition phase. And then also to deter the conflict phase is the ability as we develop and we're in the process of rapidly developing long-range precision fires capability that can tie in that. But we also see the capability, again, task force, of they can have air missile defense. They can have attack aviation if required. And they'll probably have some type of security force depending on where they're going. So what we're doing right now, and General LaCamera can talk more about that, is building an organization, and we're not waiting to get it right before we start employing it. We're getting good feedback from the commander in the field and what they want us to do as we develop this organization moving forward.
Great, and I should note that question came in from Jed Judson at Defense News. General LaCamera, if there's anything you would like to add?
Yeah, as the chief stated, we're not waiting for it to be fully operational. We're experimenting with it out here and providing feedback and making the modifications. I think, to me, is when I look at what they're doing, and when I talk to my fellow component commanders and inform back to the Army, to me, I see 2 things here: the multi-domain task force, which is the noun, and the multi-domain operations, as stated, that as we work with some of our partners and allies, that's kind of the verb. And I think we as an organization have to start thinking of the multi-domain, of all the domains. And again, how do we get after the archer and not just focusing on the arrows, and thinking in all the domains and making sure that we understand the capabilities and limitations of our joint partners, and then also our coalition partners going forward. And all that kind of gets put together, and as we get the multi-domain task force, employ that in its unique capabilities, but also make sure that the other commanders are thinking multi-domain operations.
Great, thank you. Let me ask about the Arctic. And we don't really often think about the Arctic in connection with the Indo-Pacific, but the Army has significant capabilities in its command out there and the training capabilities up in Alaska. So I was going to turn to General LaCamera and just ask about the Army in the Pacific and the Arctic. And I would note that CSIS has a project going on here reflecting increasing interest and concerns about what's going on up in the Arctic. So, General.
Yes, we have the same concerns and interest, and I've got great support from the chief in the Army on an Arctic strategy. We've got 2 brigades that are up there right now, and as we experiment in our ability to not just survive in that environment, but be able to fight and win. So, and then again, working with our partners and allies who have similar environments. But as the polar ice caps melt, I mean, we just saw this recently with the Suez Canal being bottled up there with one ship. I mean, you know, that when those sea lanes open up, that'll save, I think, 19 sail days from Asia to Western Europe. So I think it's from an economic standpoint, from the resources that exist up there, our ability to protect our interests, rests in our ability to fight and again, protect our interests. So the 2 brigades up there are not just the 2 brigades, but the Army as a whole are focusing on the equipment needed, the training, tactics, techniques, and procedures to be able to fight and not just survive in that environment.
Let me ask a quick follow-up on that about changes that you've seen over the last number of years that indicate increasing interest and capabilities in the Arctic. Those capabilities, I think, declined during the post-Cold War era as the threats up there declined, but then concerns have increased, and I think our capabilities up there increased. And I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the changes that have occurred.
Yeah, so when we started or restarted this journey, I mean, we brought in, we call them affectionately the graybeards, to sit down and talk about, what it was like in the past, and obviously with changes in equipment and things like that. But we've also noticed, others, are in their interest up there, and again, our ability to be able to compete. And that's kind of been driving what we're looking at. But again, taking advantage of the previous lessons learned, adapting it to the technological changes that have occurred, and then giving it to the soldiers on the ground, and quite frankly, working with our joint partners who also are looking at their capabilities in that region.
Great, thanks. Let me shift a little to talk about the pandemic, which has dominated our lives for the last year. CSIS has produced a report about the military and the pandemic and made the point that there was an initial stutter step by all the services, pausing basic training, for example, until new procedures were put into effect. But then all of the services were able to commence personnel transfers, training, and deployments, so that we were able to maintain our overseas commitments. And I was wondering about, from the perspective of the Army leadership and looking at the Indo-Pacific, how that happened, and whether you see that there may still be some residual readiness concerns as a result of the pandemic that will need to be made up when we're all vaccinated and life gets back to something like normal. And let me start with General McConville.
No, as you said, Mark, I mean, the pandemic affected everyone, but as I've said before, the Army can't telecommute to combat or to really the Indo-Pacific theater. So we had to kind of figure that out. And, we stopped recruiting for a while. And the way the Army works is we have to bring in about 130,000 soldiers for the total force every single year. So they have to get recruited. They have to get trained. We have worldwide commitments around the world. And so that means families are going overseas. And all this is done in a COVID environment, which is very, very challenging. Our units that are going over to critical missions go through a combat training center. Again, we paused with that. But I think very proud of how the force put the proper measures and controls in place, all the things, from wearing the masks we have right here to the separation, washing hands, and then taking, testing, and now with the vaccinations, getting after that. And so I think the force has done a very good job of maintaining the readiness. Because as I look at around the Army, the readiness of our brigades is very good right now. When we take a look at historically where we've come from, the readiness is very good. And that's been on the backs of very dedicated soldiers working through the fog and friction. Now, some of the exercise, and I'll let Paul talk about that, some of the things we had to curtail or maybe lessen the amount. But it's almost like, operating in a contaminated environment. One thing about, the Army and all the services is you got to fight the fight you have. So if you're contested on the sea, you got to accommodate that and work your way through. If you're contested in the air, you got to accommodate that. If you're contested by this thing called COVID, you need to adapt and then work your way through it. And I think the force has done a good job of that. Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Chief. As I stated in my opening remarks, I mean, we were, west of the international date line when the, quote, the lockdown started to occur, and we kept a brigade forward for a period of time. And I think, quite frankly, when it became more of a burden to the host nation, was really the tipping point to bring them back. And we have continued to do the Joint Readiness Training Centers. I think what's added to the training is the restriction of movement or the isolation piece before we could put them, bring them all together. So your previous question about the Arctic training, in a 10-man tent, in sub-zero weather, there's not a lot of, ventilation. And so making sure that those soldiers were tested and were clean before and then did it. So it really extended the training, but really forced us to do to focus on the basics. Are we where would we need to be if we had full contact every single day? No. But I'm extremely impressed with how the soldiers reacted, and to include the fact, as I stated, our support to FEMA Region 9, but also back in CONUS, where our soldiers, our medics especially, medical personnel and engineers reacted to building makeshift hospitals and pulling out PPE that we had, personal protective equipment that we had, and storage. Great success, General Abrams and his force inside of U.S. forces Korea on the peninsula, where they've been able to maintain the fight tonight while dealing with the host nation, restrictions, for lack of a better term, or constraints. And we've been able to continue to do the permanent change of station, but that adds time to what we're doing, and again, really forces us to focus on the basics. We've done a lot of things virtually. I have not been able to travel as much, but I've been able to meet with my partners and allies virtually and keep that dialogue up. But at the lower level, you can't do that. So our soldiers have to go into restriction of movement. We deploy them overseas. And we have to trust our partners and allies that they're doing the same, that they're testing, and they are. They've taken it seriously, and we've been successful. So it's been impressive to watch. Some things have been curtailed because of higher priority missions for the host nation and for ourselves. But for the most part, we've adapted and been able to maintain our readiness.
Great. Well, let me ask just one last question here, which is about the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific. We have a question that's come in from the Economic Times. And the question is, what role do you expect India to play? And I think maybe more relevant here is, what role is the United States playing with India in terms of exercises, in terms of military coordination? The Indians, of course, are, famously independent and jealous of their sovereignty, but there's been increased connection. So let me give General LaCamera the last word here regarding India.
We just finished U.S. And great exercise, and the soldiers, bonded, as stated. We protected them going in, and they were able to conduct to training, and I've met several times with my counterpart, and on developing a way ahead to continue to work and develop that relationship. And it's moving. It's very positive.
Great. Well, I think we've come to the end of our hour. I want to thank both of our guests for joining us and giving us their thoughts. We've given us a lot to think about. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get through all of our questions, so that'll provide more material for future engagement. Thank you very much on behalf of CSIS.